All right, everybody. I'm starting to lose my voice here. Sorry, I've been talking at this and had to re-record something for you guys. Let's go ahead and talk very quickly about some standard issues related to lighting. Now, if you're using Lumen, you won't have the issues that you see here. This is the kind of stuff that you see that happens when you are using let me make sure I've got my lights here. I don't have a skylight in here. This is the kind of stuff that you see when you don't have, or when you don't have Lumen. When you're using a baked lighting scenario, what ends up happening is, we'll bring in a skylight. And let me set this down a little bit. Intensity scale. And I'm going to do a bake while I talk to you guys. So what happens is when you are using stationary lights or static lights, and assuming that you've disabled Lumen, a good chunk of this class has been disabling Lumen, mostly because their machines can't handle it. If you can handle Lumen, you're not going to run into these issues. If you're using stationary or static lighting with Lumen disabled, Lumen by default is not going to use light maps, so you don't have to worry about these problems. Problems like this come up from the usage of light maps and their settings. So let's talk a little bit about some common problems and some common solutions. So let's say you have some amount of splotchiness or blotchiness in your scene. As you can see, we do have some splotchiness, we do have some incorrect lighting. Even though that looks like it's set up properly and there is no space, we are getting some lighting problems in there. Let's talk a little bit about how these problems can exist. First and foremost, these problems exist typically because light maps are not contiguous, meaning that when you are making an object, such as a long wall, it is recommended, again, this is only if you are in a baked lighting scenario, Epic recommends that you do not do something like this. If you need a longer wall, make a longer wall. Do not try to make two walls of... Do I have some overlay there? I don't think so. I don't. Do not try to make two separate walls, because what's going to end up happening is their light map resolution may run into a scenario, or you may run into a scenario with your light map resolution where you get something like this. Both this wall and this wall are set to different display resolutions. So let's go ahead and see if we can solve that by unifying some of those light map resolutions. I'm going to select all these faces, and I'm going to just go ahead and override the light map to 1024. Now I'm going to do a bake while I continue to talk to you. So what's happening is the light maps are placed in different positions in the memory, and they're calculating the lighting differently. I'm going to cancel this build right now, sorry. So we've raised the resolution of the light map. Let's also try to add some more lighting quality by adding a light mass importance volume. I know it's in there, I just hate how it doesn't come up. So we're putting a light mass importance volume in the scene, and now we're doing a rebake. So if you're having lighting problems, I feel bad for you, son. I've got 99 problems, and Sonic 06 is one of them, actually. Ugh. Alright, so now that we're baking, we have a light mass importance volume. Again, this only matters if you're doing a static or a stationary lighting setup with Lumen turned off. Remember, Lumen by default, let me see if I can turn myself here so you guys can see. There we go. Lumen by default is not going to be using dynamic, is going to be using dynamic lights. It's not going to be light map based. So if Lumen is on your personal machine, you can disregard everything that I'm talking about in this, but you really shouldn't because you should know. Remember, there's different types of lighting. There's baked lighting, using static lights, which uses light maps. There's stationary lights, which use light maps and cascade shadow maps. And there's movable that uses dynamic lighting. And then there's lumen, which is a modifier of the movable archetype, which adds better global illumination. It's important to understand which lighting scenario you're going to utilize so that you can understand which problems you're going to run into. If you do a baked lighting setup, it's very likely that you're going to run into scenarios, even though we've added some quality, you're going to run into scenarios like this. Okay, so we've added some, we still have problems in here. We still have some problems in here. We have decent lighting over here. That's not good right there. That's not going to work out. Okay, so we added light map resolution. We added quality. What do we do now? Well, there's only so much you can do when it's a baked lighting scenario. When you're using baked lighting, you're going to have to also look into your light mask settings as well. I'm going to tell you right now, here there be dragons. I strongly discourage students from spending too much time in here, especially now because you have Lumen, but I strongly discourage first-time students from hopping into the light mask settings because this is how you affect, let me bring up my notes here. Let's see, where are my notes here? This is where you start running into scenarios where you start really messing up with the lighting. In terms of you are changing the property of the gatherer when you are lighting, right? That is going to affect your overall quality as a whole. What we are seeing here is essentially the types of scale that we can use to increase the accuracy of the bounce lighting inside of a baked lighting scenario. If the word says light mask, then it is baked. If you are using Lumen, you do not have to worry about this. If you're using real-time lights, you don't have to worry about this, fully movable. But if you're using stationary or static, which does sometimes make static light maps, you're going to have to look at them. And if you are using stationary lights in a Lumen environment, meaning it's Lumen at the project level, the lights are already being calculated as movable. You don't need to worry about changing them. It's only if you turn Lumen off does this become important. And not every studio is going to use Lumen because all the games are going to somewhat look the same after a while. Okay, anyways. This is where you start really affecting the way that the math for lighting works. So for example, number of lighting bounces increase or decreases the amount of accuracy that you have in your lighting. For example, a bounce is considered, indirect lighting is not the first hit, so the first hit is like from the sun to the ground. That's 0 hit. The first bounce that comes off of that surface, that's 1 hit and that's 1 bounce. And then another wall is 2, and then a final wall is 3, and then it comes back to the engine and says, hey, look, I have all these calculations, praise me. And then the engine's like, okay, you got decent calculations. Watch what happens if I set this to 0, and then I do another bake. Let's see if they changed anything in here. Bounce 1 takes the most time. Okay, they talked about it. So it's going to take a little bit longer to build for some reason. Don't know why. We'll just let it do its thing. But I've turned off all the bounces, so we're not going to get any additional lighting bounces, so we're going to get something terrifying. We'll let the Z buffer catch up. There we go. And as you can see, we're not getting any additional bounces aside of the first hit, which is going to be the floor. Just make sure I've got enough light map information. Yeah, right. So you see how that's kind of really ineffective. And not only that, we're not getting a very accurate lighting bounce in general in here because it's letting the floor light the ground, because we are getting some light bleed in on these calculations. So that's another issue that you have to look out for. But you see that we're not getting any bounces. We are getting skylight bounces, which is what is happening right there. If you want more accuracy, say we're going to raise this to 5, not 6. We're going to raise the amount of bounces to 5, and we'll add another skylight bounce. But I'm going to increase the lighting level scale, which means that the quality of the lighting will be lower. So like 1.5. So what that means is it's going to treat every centimeter as a centimeter and a half, which means that will become less accurate. Let's go ahead and hit build and see if we get a better lighting outcome. I could teach an entire class on just pure lighting, but because we only have this week and last week to talk about this kind of stuff, it's important for you guys to know what you're getting into. I have my own personal settings that I like setting that I'm going to show you guys here in a sec, but let's see. Just going to give that a sec. I'm going to pause here for a second so I can get a screen cap. Alright, I'm back. My bake's finished. So as you can see, we've reduced the quality of the lighting. It's not very accurate, but we actually have some softer corners now. And you'll notice that we have some slightly softer corners. That's totally okay. So you see that we've affected somewhat the lighting on the outside as well. We've gotten rid of some of the splotchiness by increasing the amount of indirect bounces. But that doesn't necessarily give us the best kind of solution, right? The other option is to go into your build lighting quality, and then change the quality level to a higher production value. I'm going to change this to medium, and I'm going to do another build. Generally speaking, for your final renders, you should turn it up all the way. And again, it only becomes important if you are not using Lumen. I keep iterating that, or reiterating that, because it's still important, because if you can use Lumen, it might be a good idea to stay on Lumen. If you can't use Lumen because you're either on UE4 or your computer can't handle it, then you have to use the light mass or fully movable lighting. For most beginner students, I just strongly recommend, it's okay to use movable. It really is. If you don't want to spend too much time making the lighting look decent, if you want to just get something that looks good and get started right away, use movable lighting. However, if your game requires fog or a certain kind of atmosphere, or you need atmospheric fog, this is where your light rays and Jesus rays and light fog all come into play. If you need that for whatever reason, that's where your lighting immediately becomes more technical, right? So it's really more difficult then for beginners, because you're already at the point where you need to be an intermediate. It becomes more difficult to ascertain what is going to be useful for your particular scene. Now I've set this to medium, and it should give me some better results. We'll let the Z buffer clean up. Okay, I see a little bit of cleanup over here. That's nicer, isn't it? That looks a little nicer. We've got a little bit more. We've got a little more cleanup up here. The ground is accurately-ish lit. We still got some problems down here. Those are some weird problems. But again, we've increased the quality to medium. We still have some problems with our lighting calculations up there, so on and so forth. The other thing is to recognize that all of your lighting is going to look bad on a flat, unshaded surface. That is by design. If your objects, and let me just grab all these. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to grab the I'm just going to cramp critical walls here, and then I'll move around. If you are going to use the flat shaded color here, and you're going to somehow convince yourself that this is going to look good, I've got some news for you. Yeah, it's restored content. It ain't gonna look good. Epic strongly recommends that if you're going to be using jump over here, sorry about that. If you're going to be texturing things, it's generally a good idea to texture them because, funnily enough, aside of obviously like lineup issues and whatnot that you'll run into with this kind of stuff, texturing hides a lot of problems. That's just the way it is. Texturing hides a lot of sins. Something like this is very difficult to hide. Epic recommends that if you have seams like this, I'm going to save that. What seams? Yeah, that's the recommendation. If you have horrible seams that you don't want to go out and fix the light maps on, Epic recommends you cover them. So something like this, I would cover. Stuff like this down here. No, notice that our weird blotchy light is kind of gone. Yeah, that's kind of the nature of the beast. Fixing things with good texturing is what solves a lot of problems. If only you guys could see some of the stuff that I've worked on that I know looks like crap, but good texturing hides a lot of problems. And ultimately, if all of this fails and you cannot hide all of your issues, and even if you set up your lighting to production and it doesn't go away, the last two options are, the first option of the last two is you need to remake the asset in order to have a more contiguous face, meaning that instead of making a wall that is two walls, you make one long wall, right? Instead of having two short walls, you make one long wall, and then you keep repeating that. It just depends on whether or not you're having massive lighting problems. The other one is that you can spend a lot of time learning how to use the light maps and light mask settings to do something like, I don't know, this is scary, by the way, static lighting level scale. It means that for every centimeter, the light will pretend that every centimeter is 0.1 centimeter. So it's going to keep hitting over every centimeter. It's going to do every little detail, every little nook and cranny. Cram this bad boy up to 100, 15 skylight bounces, indirect lighting quality will be 10, smoothness will be 0.75, environment color will be fine, environment intensity fine, diffuse boost is fine, use ambient occlusion, absolutely, no generation, no material diffuse, no ambient occlusion, will not compress our light maps. We will use the, you think, volumetric light map, volumetric lighting. We don't have any volumetric lighting in here. That's fine. Direct illumination will be set to 0. Indirect illumination will be set to 0.2. Occlusion exponent will be a little bit lower, 0.75. These are my personal settings. And let's see. I want to do fully occluded. That's fine. Max occlusion distance. That's fine. Okay, that'll be fine. I'm gonna do this right now. I'm gonna half the quality of a lot of this stuff, so that it doesn't so I don't spend the next year trying to render this. Okay, so all I've done is, let's set this back up to like maybe 0.75, just for the example, because otherwise it's going to take forever to cook. Let me see, let me think about what other settings I can use. Let me think, that'll fine. Don't worry about ambient occlusion, don't worry about that. In fact, ambient occlusion doesn't even exist in Lumen. We don't have to worry about this. Okay, I'm also going to change my lighting quality. I'm going to leave it on medium. I'm sorry, guys. I just don't want to be here for 2 hours and let this render. So I'm going to go ahead and render this out. I am also going to post on screen some general settings to get the best baked lighting you can. These are based on my personal settings. I also use a different alternate settings. Again, this matters if you are going to be using any kind of light baking. For beginners, I imagine most of you guys will be using movable lighting. Most of your computers can handle it and it'll be fine. But when you are compressing maps and lights for games where a game can't have fully real-time light, this is the kind of stuff you run into. The new generation of Lumen should cure some of those problems, but only for people who are at the cutting edge of technology. Games are still being made using these methods, so just keep that in mind. Lumen is just there as a different stage of the movable light. Games that cannot have 100% movable light because of budgetary or size constraints have to use baked lighting anyways. So you can still get some amazing looking bakes this way. I'm going to start this bake. And we're going to hope for the best. And we're going to take a look at it and examine what it looks like before and after. I hope it doesn't take too long. I'll be right back. Yes, I'm still sitting here. All right, we're finished here. Obvious some still issues. Obvious some still issues. But you see that the lighting is a lot nicer than it was previously. For a second while it's catching up, we can see kind of like an archviz look. And in fact, if I change the cinematic viewport, get some better cinematic lighting, you see that this does have an effect. This does look better. Now, obviously there's some issues with the ground and the way the ground clutter is and whatnot. How would you fix that? Well, at this point, you would have to either add more accuracy, do another render, or not have your house rely on these like tenuous connections in order for it to have like that light bleed in. There's also another technique called encapsulation, where you could use a box. If you're building a house or a scene inside of an environment, you capture it and make sure that the inside, I'm going to save this so you guys can see it. And I'll be right back. I know you guys have noticed, but I'm compiling about 5,000 shaders for this project that I have yet to update to UE5. I'm probably going to have to wrap up those thoughts there, but essentially what encapsulation does is it takes that house that we had and then we put it inside of a box, and then we use things like point lights to light the interior of those spaces in order to prevent light from getting in, which eliminates the need for error correction, right? There are a bunch of different methodologies to approach. And the final being that Unreal does not like things with no thickness, meaning that if you're using planes, planes like to let light through. But it's already that you saw that those objects, those thicker objects, were letting light through anyway. But that point that they were connected, where they were touching, was literally only a pixel long. So when you have something like that with no thickness in between the outside and the inside, just literally you're connecting. I have nothing with corners. Oh yes, I have some cards here that I can use. So these cards assume that they have some thickness, right? But when they're like this, light won't get through. But when they are like this, where's that thickness in the corner? There is none. The thickness is basically equivalent to 1. And because they're barely touching, because you have those barely touching each other, light can very easily get through. So the solution for objects that are doing that is either rebuild the object, add a blocker, which means you put something in there that prevents the light from getting in that the player can't see. You use encapsulation, which covers the scene completely in a box and allows you to build inside of the scene using point lights, which might work a little better. Or you use lumen, and then you deal with the issues of lumen being new, and I've had lumen crash on me a few times already, and then whether or not your machine can run lumen. So this is the long and short explanation for everything. For you guys, I am not going to expect a grandiose understanding of lighting right out of the box. Lighting and the visuals in UE4 and UE5 can be very, very difficult to learn, especially as a newcomer. But everything that I'm sure you guys have seen has been related to just how it looks. And that's fair. We do have a project coming up by week 8 or week 10. I haven't decided yet. That is going to be doing a full-on landscape. I am not going to expect people to be able to light everything amazingly and beautifully. If you are a lumen user, use the knowledge and understanding of creating basic lights from movable lights, because all lumen is a better movable light with better reflections and better global illumination. People who can't access lumen, disable lumen, and think about maybe using a movable light setup or a stationary light setup. Nobody in this class should be using a static light setup. Nobody is really using it anyway anymore, but just know that it exists. Static lighting is good, like what I explained, for having individualized lights that don't necessarily need to cast dynamic shadows. Those are really good in scenes. Stationary lights are good when you have things that move but also need to cast light map shadows. But if you are using lumen, lumen is going to solve all of those problems for you. But not every game is going to be able to use lumen. Every game out there on the market can use static and stationary lighting. That's just kind of how it is. But not every game is going to be able to use lumen. And without being able to use lumen, you have to solve some of those issues in the way that I showed you guys how those issues are solved. The best way to go forward for you guys who are new is either stick to lumen or stick to movable lighting. Those are going to be fully dynamic, and those are always going to at least not have the issues that baked lighting has. If you are interested in being a lighting artist for current generation games, it might be worth your time to do a little bit of extra research into light baking, at least for now, and then maybe once you start working on your larger environments later on in the semester, you can think about how you want to do it. So there's an option for everyone here. People who want to become lighting artists or level designers should probably focus on making something technically new. Lumen is probably going to be the way it is. For those of you who can't use lumen, it's going to be a baked lighting scenario or a movable lighting scenario. But there's a lot of room here to learn brand new and different things. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up. This is not going to open for at least an hour, judging by how fast it's going. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up, because otherwise we would be in class and watching it open anyways, and that's really typically what I would do in our class if we were in person. Is I open all my projects at the very beginning, or I show up like an hour in advance and then open my projects and hope that they're open by the time class starts, because these projects always take forever to open. That's just the nature of the beast. Alright? Alright, let me double check one more thing to see if I have actually anything to add before I move on to the final video, the outro for this week. Make sure that's good. Okay. All right. We're moving on to the outro, guys, so I will see you guys in the next one.